Hello, and welcome to None of the Above. My name is Steve Nemirovsky, and I'm your host. None of the Above is a political program where we examine the underlying causes of all the dysfunction and polarization in our political system and our government. We intend to educate our listeners and viewers on these causes, and we try to talk about solution sets. We don't want to only talk about problems here. We want to talk about problems. We want to talk about solutions. In our last show, we finished a two-part discussion on campaign finance reform. And if you haven't seen those shows, I certainly welcome you to them. Campaign finance reform is probably the poster child for what people think is the most disruptive element in our political system. And as our guest, we had Peter Wallison, and we talked about his book and some solution sets. After Peter's interview, which again I commend to you, we had an interview with Jeff Pele, who is with Ballotpedia. Ballotpedia is one of our favorite political websites and probably more information than you could ever want to find about how our political system works. And in our interview with Jeff, we were talking about why we don't have competitive races in the general election these days. And Jeff startled me during that interview because he said Ballotpedia's prediction is that in 2014 we may have as few as 30 competitive races. So think about that. There's 435 members of Congress, and they're predicting we may have as few as 30 competitive races. Now, Jeff explains how they define competitiveness, and based upon that, 30 out of 435, which is roughly 7%. So reverse that, and we're talking about perhaps 93% of the current members in Congress, absent retirement or illness or whatever, 93% of the current members of Congress, the incumbents, being reelected in 2014. So this is kind of what we're up against, and you understand how a dysfunctional system can become when you have that type of incumbency. On today's show, we're going to look ahead to redistricting and talk about implications of redistricting on dysfunction and polarization. But before we get there, I want to give you another slant on this lack of competitiveness in Congress and talk about it from another perspective. So what we have here, and I have next to me, is a chart that I've borrowed from the Cook Political Report for 2013. And the title of this, I hope you can read this, is The Incredible Shrinking Swing Seat 1998 to 214. And what the Cook Report has done, and I've borrowed from them, so I want to give them all the credit, is on the left side here, they are showing the number of seats that were held historically by Democrats, Republicans, and then swing seats, the number of seats that were contested, so to speak. So as far back as 1998, this black line here, which is the swing seats, was actually the largest component of Congress. As far back as 1998, there was 164 competitive seats in Congress, 148 fairly solid seats for Republicans, and then 123 fairly solid seats for Democrats. And again, I hope you can see this chart. What they're defining as a Democratic seat is a seat where the Democrat would be expected, based upon polling or whatever their characteristics are or their requirements are, to garner 5% or greater victory margin. Similar for Republicans, 5% or greater victory margin. And they're defining a swing seat as basically a seat where the competitiveness factor is within 5%. I would suggest to you that that might be one of the major differences between Cook and Ballotpedia in how they define competitiveness. But again, starting out 1998, 16 years ago, roughly 7 election cycles for Congress, we actually had a situation where there were more competitive seats than, so to speak, guaranteed incumbent seats. Now what you'll notice is the red line here for Republicans has actually been growing, and you take it out to the prediction for 2014. I don't know if you can see this number. They're predicting that for 2014, we would have roughly 186 virtually guaranteed Republican seats in Congress. If you follow the Democratic line, that also has been steadily increasing. So it's increased from 123 up to a prediction of 2014 of about 159 locked-in Democratic congressional seats in Congress. So the residual of that becomes 90 seats. And you can see how the line for the swing seats has digressed over the years. We started out at that 164 number in 1998. Slowly but surely has been digressing to the fact that We're now looking at 90 competitive seats according to Cook in 2014, 30 competitive seats according to Ballotpedia in 2014. So at the tight end for the Ballotpedia number, you're looking at maybe 7% competitive, and even if you go by the Cook number, you're barely over 20% competitive seats in Congress. So this is part of the problem for dysfunction. This is part of the problem for polarization. We do not have a competitive Congress. One of the reasons we don't have a competitive Congress, and perhaps the number one reason from my perspective we don't have a competitive Congress, is the fact that we have a redistricting that has occurred based upon the 2010 census, and that has driven a very polarized and a Congress, and one that, based upon the maps that have been drawn, does not allow for competitive seats. So what we're going to do today is start another two-part series. Hopefully you'll be with us for both parts. And we're going to examine redistricting. We're going to look at the underlying history of redistricting, the constitutional requirements. Then we're going to advance out to talk about solution sets. Because again, remember, none of the above is about solutions, not just problems, but solutions. And then following that interview, the second segment of the interview on our show, we're going to overlap redistricting and campaigning and citizen lobbying that we've talked about before, and talk about how some of these things are coming together in today's political world.